Welcome, everyone. On this episode of the SurgeonMasters podcast, I have with me Ken Dodge, a family physician and physician coach. Welcome, Ken.
Happy to be here.
So, Ken, I appreciate your skills as a physician coach, appreciate your history as a family physician, and we've had a lot of great conversations over the time that we've gotten to know each other. I'd love for you to be open to a conversation with us today on this podcast.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I really would like to talk more about the whole concept of needs. I would tell you as a primary care doc and even as physician coach, I'm amazed at how vague needs are to the people I'm talking to. And so I wanted to start with just a simple idea in regards of needs, and that is that most of our stress, our frustration, even burnout doesn't come from not knowing what to do. It comes from not knowing what we need. I was thinking of, if you take a recent moment where you could have felt irritated or overwhelmed or just not on, you were off. You couldn't name it, but in those moments, we try to fix a situation, but we rarely stop to ask, what is this actually pointing to? What do I need right now? So today, if we could cover needs and why they matter, and if we identify those needs, how they might make a difference in our lives for making decisions or reducing stress, that would be great.
That's fantastic. And it might be really tough for me, since I've never had any burnout in my career or any stress or irritation. And even in the last few weeks, it's so chill. There's no stress or anything. But no, and in all seriousness, like we could probably all come up with examples, and maybe that's where each of us sort of sets our mind right now of one of those things. Give me some example of what you mean more specifically about needs. Define needs, perhaps.
Yeah, when I say needs, I don't mean preferences or wants. I'm talking about the core human drivers. What comes to mind? We need rest, sleep, autonomy, that independence. We need to have a sense of meaning. What are we doing in this world? Connection. We need to be able to relate to people. We absolutely need respect. We need competence. And the ones I just mentioned, they're not optional. Without them being met, some kind of suffering or adversity will occur. And I can emphasize trying to differentiate wants versus needs. Wants means that no real suffering or adversity occurs. If you don't get your needs met, adversity of some nature is going to take place. And so these needs that I'm speaking of are constantly shaping our decisions, our behaviors, how we experience our work and life, whether we're aware of them or not.
Yeah, I noticed just where my thoughts go of, one's probably the first one I jumped to was some ice cream, but even like, a higher compensation or pay or reimbursement, right? That is kind of a want. I'm not saying that there might not be some needs there, but probably what you're driving at are better. And I think, again, any one of us could come up with examples of their wants. And you've given us great examples of some core needs. Tell me a little bit more, like if I recognize that difference, what's next?
Well, I think an underlying recognition is that needs are going to drive our behavior. To an accountant, this probably sounds really weird, but every decision we make is an attempt to meet a need. And if we stay focused on medicine, if the physician stays late, it may be that they just have a need for competence or safety. If saying yes to extra work may just be that physician's need for approval or contribution. Here's something that goes beyond just being a physician, avoiding a conversation. Maybe a need to avoid conflict or to preserve a connection. And so the challenge is when we don't identify the need, we're going to misinterpret the problem. And in medical language, we miss the diagnosis.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is a lot of times we jump ahead. Is that fair to say?
I would say I don't know about jumping ahead as much as we start. Make it simple. We start treating a sinus infection, and we know it's bacterial. We haven't made the diagnosis. We know it has something to do with the head, all right, but we haven't begun to pin it down, and so we're throwing everything at it. And in that process of throwing everything at it, it's just easy to get overwhelmed and we can miss things. We can feel like the system around us is just so frustrating. They're not listening to me. But if we look underneath all of that, there's usually just something more specific. If we get outside of the diagnosis of sinusitis, we might say that we really have a greater need for control over my time, or I need to feel valued, honored. I need clarity. If we don't know what we're looking for, we're not going to come up with a good solution.
And I think I get it. I mean, I do get it. You're explaining it very well. I'm attaching another example besides the sinus infection. I'm staying late, making this example. If I'm staying late doing charting or the EMR or something, and I notice I'm frustrated, then taking it to the next step is it because I'm so tired, right? Is it because I'm sleepy, right? Or is it for that particular situation of frustration? Is it because I need it to be, really accurate and feel like I did a good job? But you're kind of pointing out there's that next layer, I think is what I'm hearing.
Yes. And knowing what that next layer is allows us then to begin to target a solution to where we're going.
That it sounds like, if I'm putting 2 and 2 equal 4, that if I have those needs, then if I don't have those needs met, something's going to happen.
Precisely. And in fact, that concept that you just alluded to is probably one of the most important points I would love to emphasize today, because unmet needs are not just going to go away. They're going to show up in some other way, commonly irritation, or you talked about being tired, fatigue, they'll show up. You might end up just withdrawing. You're going to overwork, we talked about. You can become very resentful. And you put all those things together, and often we broadly learn that grouping of symptoms as burnout. And physicians in particular, burnout, it's not we're working too much. It's often we just have prolonged unmet needs within that work. I don't know how to say it, so I'm going to just repeat that concept. Burnout is not working too much. It's having those prolonged unmet needs within our work. And if we have unmet needs, they're not going to go away. They're present.
Excellent. And I appreciate that. I like hearing an emphasis on a different angle or a different way to describe burnout, because people get a little frustrated about the concept or discussion, in the sense that it's overstated or overused without much of an explanation of perhaps what it is. And your definition is very nice. But then there's what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, and we can talk more about that as we go along. But to me, when you say, what are we going to do about it, that gets right into what's the strategy of managing something. And so understanding that we have needs and we then have strategies. And I want to take, if you allow me just a moment, to really separate these two, because so often we merge those two together. The strategy becomes the need, when in reality, we have needs and then we can look for strategies. I define needs are the why, the needs are the diagnosis, where strategies are the how, the strategies are the treatment. Needs are consistent, many times non-negotiable, where strategies are flexible, which gives us a lot of wiggle room. And if I were to give you an example, a physician who has a strong need for competence and safety, their strategy could be to overwork by staying late, double and triple checking everything, taking on more responsibility. And that strategy may work for a while, but over time, it leads to that exhaustion, less efficiency. and definitely frustration. And not because the need is wrong, it's because the strategy is no longer serving the need effectively. And another quick example is if you have two colleagues in conflict, not that that would ever happen in our world, have two colleagues in conflict, but
Of course not.
no, of course not. But if one needs control and time management, their strategy is to push the pace. If one needs confidence and safety, their strategy is going to be slow things down. And so they're going to argue about workflow. But underneath, they're arguing about the strategy for their goals without understanding each other's needs. What looks like a conflict of needs is, again, just a conflict of strategies for meeting those needs. And one of the things that may succinctly say that when you get stuck in a relationship, it's often not because you don't care about what's going on, but because you become so locked into your strategy that it no longer serves the need that you need it to serve.
You got me wrapped in now. I almost just want to hear next steps kind of. I like how you've laid that out. It made me sort of visualize, okay, if I notice the difference and that the why is there, the how is much more flexible. The why is not going away.
Boy, you just summarized that so well. The why doesn't go away, but the how has flexibility if we think about it. And I'll tell you, if we've taken the time to identify our needs, then in our relationships with others, things change. Decisions become more clear. Instead of, I shouldn't have taken this, or I should take this on, you ask yourself, what do I need right now? And decisions start to organize themselves. Besides decisions, communication improves, and this is huge. Instead of saying, this schedule is ridiculous, you can say, I need more control over my time. I need support. And that shifts that conversation from being a complaint to one of having clarity. You're no longer that victim. And probably here's a huge one right in itself. The boundaries become easier. A simple definition of a boundary is boundaries are the things we do to protect what we need. So if we don't know our needs, boundaries feel arbitrary, guilt-inducing. But if you do know what you're needing, then it becomes very much a sensation of this is necessary. I am grounded in it. I can ask. And that makes life so much better. And burnout becomes understandable. And instead of just saying, I'm exhausted, we can begin to say, which needs have been consistently unmet? And again, in burnout, autonomy, that sense of independence, that need for recognition, that doing something that has meaning and at the same time having rest. If those needs aren't there, that's the underlying thing for being exhausted, which allows me to understand how to do. So we have an opportunity to make decisions clear, communication becomes better, boundaries get set, and burnout is treatable before it ever becomes an issue to be treated, if you so wish to think of it that way.
Sure, it sounds like there's an angle that's prevention, right?
Oh, it's just huge, but it requires staying tuned in and very much aware.
And yet you're also highlighting that it can be a level of retrospective reflection, then turning it into, if I'm understanding correctly, an improved strategy. But it sounds like you create a bit of a sequence of, let me have you clarify the sequence of kind of the way to kind of repeat this in our reflection to address whatever it is that we're noticing.
Yeah, I mean, this gets down into, in my mind, the heart of, all right, I've got needs. You've sold me on the fact that I have needs, but how do we become tuned to what those needs are? And so I've given some thought to how that can be. And there's so many different ways that we can look at it, but maybe some simple ones is number one, looking at our frustration, following the frustration. The line of follow the money. Well, this is follow the frustration. What is bothering me repetitively? Frustration is often a signal, again, of an unmet need. Or we can notice energy. What consistently drains you? What takes the life out of you? And on the other side of that question, what gives you energy?
Hmm.
It can be both positive and negative. They don't have to be one or the other. But energy is often easier to access than emotion. And if we start paying attention to our overreactions, which means usually it's after the fact, but we can still capture that larger reaction. And if with that larger reaction, we know that there's a need that lays underneath of it. For example, if I had excessive fear, it may be that I just need for protection, help, some type of refuge. If I have an excessive amount of guilt, man, I just need to be forgiven. Or if I had shame, I need to be felt, to be understood. And I might emphasize, for me, guilt and shame are so often the emotions that I have. And so knowing that when they show up, I need to be felt, to be understood, or I need some type of protection. And maybe one last thing to simply say, and this one just requires practice. Practice, practice, practice. I believe I heard you say that once or twice.
Yeah.
But there's a simple 3-question pause. What am I experiencing or feeling? What might this be pointing to? And what do I need right now? If we would give ourselves that 3-question pause, we're in the middle of a conversation, even excusing ourselves if it's an important conversation, and promising to come back and beginning to say, what am I experiencing or feeling? Well, what's going on here? What's it pointing at? And then finally hitting the home run ball. What do I need right now? I think that can give us some clarity that allows the rest of the conversation to then have a potential solution.
That's fantastic. And, as you were sharing, I was thinking about almost every person, every relationship, myself, whatever, but kind of bring this back to the physician audience. I mean, I think you have, but just if you want to wrap that up into that perspective, because a lot of the people listening now are physicians or surgeons.
Well, as physicians, we've been trained to prioritize others. We certainly have been encouraged to push through fatigue. We override our needs when necessary. And this is the part of us that some would say, well, we are now excellent physicians because we do that. But over time, that ability to override our needs becomes the risk of ignoring them. And when needs are consistently ignored, our clarity decreases, energy decreases, and connection to our work and others, it just begins to narrow. Burnout often equals those unmet needs of autonomy, meaning, recognition, and rest. So being aware just helps us with all of that.
I think you've summarized it super well, but if you were to reinforce anything, which is kind of the theme of our podcast, is like, what's the bullet points or what's the take home points for our listeners?
Yeah, I would leave it this simply, that most of us have become very good at solving problems, but many of the problems we're trying to solve are actually unmet needs asking to be recognized. And so this week, and I encourage we just focus this week, it's manageable. Instead of asking, what should I do? Let's try asking, what do I need? And you may find the answer is simpler and more effective than you ever expected it to be.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Ken. Thanks for sharing that with our audience.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
There you have it. This is Jeff Smith along with Dr. Ken Dodge. Until our next podcast, ciao.